Welcome to Focus, Faith, and Fueling, the Winning Edge podcast, where young athletes, parents, and coaches learn how mindset, nutrition, and faith work together to elevate performance, resilience, and overall health.
What you eat and how you think can elevate and transform your game. If you're ready to gain a true mental edge, fuel your body with purpose, and stay grounded in what truly matters, then this podcast is for you.
We are your hosts. I'm Lindsay, former collegiate athlete, author, coach, and educational coach for over 20 years, and a mom to two young athletes.
And I'm Stacy, sports dietitian, author, speaker, and nutritional consultant for over 19 years, and a mom of two teen athletes. Today's episode is called Protein, the Power Player: What's New, What's True, and Why It Matters for Everyone. We're going to break down the new dietary guidelines for protein and what they really mean in context. Tackle some top questions from our athletes and everyday listeners about satiety, performance, and healthy aging, and clear up the confusion around protein quality, timing, and animal sources, so you walk away with simple, actionable ways to optimize protein in your daily life. I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Kristen Hicks-Roof, Director of Human Nutrition and Nutrition Research at the National Pork Board, where she leads research and education initiatives on pork's role in healthy, evidence-based dietary patterns for diverse populations. Kristen is a registered dietitian nutritionist with a PhD in nutrition science from Texas A&M University. Her research centers on protein quality, nutrient density, and how animal-sourced foods can support health across the lifespan. Before her current role, Dr. Hicks-Roof was a nutrition and dietetics professor at the University of North Florida, where she conducted and mentored research on nutrition education, public opinion, and healthy eating behaviors, and earned recognition for her work. Her publications and professional contributions span dietary guidance development, practical nutrition education, and translating complex nutrition science into real-world recommendations for both clinicians and consumers. Today, she brings that blend of rigorous research and practical insights to help us unpack what's truly new with protein, what matters the most for feeling fuller, performing better, and protecting muscle and function as we age, and how to put all of this into practice, whether you're a competitive athlete, a busy parent, a coach, or someone who's just trying to age well. Kristen, thank you so much for being on with us today. I always love when we've got great PhD researchers like yourself in this space that can come on and talk to our listeners, whether it's our athletes or our parents or coaches, and just help them through these spaces. So thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be on, and I love talking about protein. So what a better way to start a conversation?
Yeah. So, okay, let's jump in. Protein is all the buzz right now. And I feel like it's been the buzz for a while. Tell us what's going on in the protein world. What's new, what's changing? Kind of give us some of that background.
Yeah, so I would say, protein has really gained momentum in 25, and it is escalating throughout 26 as well. And there's a lot of underlying factors to why you're seeing that. I think number one, kind of the most prevalent that you're seeing in the media is related to MAHA and how they are really talking about protein differently in terms of not only the sources of protein, but why and how protein is so important, which, number one, the fact that this administration is even talking about nutrition is important.
Yeah,
but
I've
then
said
when
that
they're
for a
talking
while
about,
now. Let's not die on any swords we don't need to die on. Let's be excited about that they are talking about nutrition.
yeah, and I think the fact that protein, so for those of you who may not know, the previous recommendations for protein, the RDA, recommended dietary allowance, was 0.8 grams per kilogram. It's been like that for decades. And this new Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2025 to 2030 recommends a 1.2 to a 1.6 gram per kilogram, which is a 50 to 100% increase compared to the old RDA. And that is really important because it kind of reminds me, honestly, Stacy, of the egg story, that it took eggs 40 years to help show that dietary cholesterol and egg yolks did not contribute to negative cardiovascular events. And I think we're having the same thing in the protein world. The researchers, the experts out there in the protein research have been nodding that, wow, our protein recommendation is actually really low. I think someone had said the other day, the RDA is the floor, not the ceiling. I think that's really important.
So I want to talk about that for a second, because I think that's something we've talked before the dietary guidelines changed, even last year when we were talking about protein. 0.8 grams per kilogram was really meant to be preventing malnutrition. It was not meant to be promoting optimal health. And those things are very different.
Yeah, and that's completely right. But I don't think an everyday person may not really understand that, right? Like, what
Yeah.
is optimal health to an everyday person? Because the definition may be different for you than it might be for me. But in the research realm, especially when you look at vulnerable populations such as aging, which we see a lot of the research
Yeah.
in, you really do need that higher protein recommendation to be able to maintain muscle mass, metabolic health, satiety, weight management, healthy aging. I mean, all of these things come into play. And I think we need a lot more research in children and adolescents to see, like, does that protein recommendation make sense for them? And maybe it's increase or maybe it's decrease or maybe it's that same window. I don't, yes, we're making that generalization right now, but the science is not all the way there that for the young children, right? Under 18,
Yeah.
but we know for adults the science has been there. And so with the new dietary guidelines, the science has caught up to the policy. And that
Yeah. Which
often
is
times happens.
it usually is like a little bit lagging. I think about working on the guidelines for cholesterol, and the dietary guidelines didn't change until almost a decade later, which is
Right.
crazy
And
because
I think,
nutrition is such a new science and we do have a lot to learn.
and there's so much research that you need to be able to change these federal guidelines. It's not one randomized control trial, right? You have
Yeah.
multiple epi studies, you have review papers, you have randomized control trials. So you need a substantial amount of evidence to be able to change that. And for those of you who aren't in the research space, a human clinical trial can take 2 years to complete. So when you think about the amount of time that would go in to be able to do the research and then ultimately communicate and have impact on policy, it
Talk
does
about this
take
for a
time.
minute. I'm going to take us off topic because you're an industry researcher. But one of the things that I find is people often don't realize how nutrition historically, a lot of it is observational studies, or we're looking at meta-analysis of, observational studies. It's really hard to do clinical controlled gold standard studies and then to have lots of them to look at in aggregate. And then it's even harder to have absence of any sort of funding because who otherwise would ask the questions? And so sometimes what I see is people have this high sense of skepticism for industry funded studies. But what I realized working for Texas Beef is these are sometimes the most rigorous. People are looking at them under a microscope. Can you just talk to our listeners about that for a minute and what you really see from the industry side?
Yeah, I think it's a sticky situation, Stacy. I get both sides. Obviously, I come from the academic world, and I remember talking about this and teaching students. Always look at it not differently, but you should always take any type of bias under consideration, no matter whatever the type of bias might be, whether it's from the researcher or the funder. But I think you hit the nail on the head in the sense of you need people to fund research, right? And we do have federal funding, but federal funding simply cannot cover the sheer amount of research that we need to have. And so you have other types of research. And this is where I think people lump everything into industry funding is there's actually nuance within industry funding. You have industry as in branded food products
Yeah.
who are going to do competitive research to be able to make their product claims different from their counterparts. So that is a type of industry research. You also have non-competitive industry research, which oftentimes that's your commodity boards. They're not representing a product per se, they're representing a whole category or a whole type of product or a whole supply chain. And so, is there a bias in that? I think the bias in that is that they know the nutritional makeup of their products. And so they're going to invest in nutrition research that makes sense for what their product is. So are you going to see research on blueberries looking at protein? Probably not. Just like you're not going to see a pork research funded project looking at anthocyanins, right? Because it just doesn't make sense. So that's where you kind of get a bit of nuance. And then you also have your organizations, right? Like American Heart Association or these foundations, which also do research. And again, a lot of that gets lumped into industry, but there is nuance within that. And we need all of it. I love
Yeah.
Shailene. She always talks about the pieces of the funding puzzle. You need all of them together to be able to tell a complete story. Because if it was only funded by one group, I think you should have skepticism that those findings should align with what you'd see in federal funded grants and what you'd see in industry funded grants, right? And those three, you would triangulate them to be able to tell a more complete story. So
I
it's just
love that.
part of the piece of the puzzle.
I love the pieces of the puzzle. I also think there's oftentimes kind of this like misnomer that with academic research, people don't have their own biases around food and bring those through. And so I do love triangulating it so that we're checking those biases and the science is really doing the work of telling us what's true and what's not true.
I also think in science, we live in a gray area. Science changes. Even though one thing is common and a lot of people have believability on it, you have scientists who challenge the status quo. And when you get scientists to challenge the status quo, which we're seeing more academics do now than you ever have
Yeah.
seen in the history of nutrition research, when you get them to challenge status quo, all of a sudden the status quo changes. So when people are, maybe upset about the new protein recommendations with the dietary guidelines, it took researchers to challenge saying, maybe that's not optimal intake. How do we have the recommendations, whether it's outcomes like muscle protein synthesis or it's outcomes related to metabolic health? How do you have those outcomes to challenge? And then ultimately, that is what's going to be reflective in the future of nutrition science and those related policies.
I love it when we challenge the status quo with cholesterol. What's happened with protein, the conversation with Dr. Kevin Mackey around saturated fats. And I think about, someone who came from retail, we didn't used to put added sugars on a package and look at carbohydrates in that way. But I think as we continue to challenge the status quo of how we look at these spaces, we collectively get smarter. I think that could be frustrating for consumers, but I always say we reserve the right to continue to get smarter.
Yeah, and I think it is our job, if you're a clinician, if you are a dietitian, a health professional, a strength coach, whatever role you might play, you have to understand that science changes. And that means that your beliefs or your dedication to what those previous recommendations are need to potentially be modified. And that's a really hard thing. People don't like change, especially if they develop programs or they have, handouts and modules related to old content. It's hard to make that change, but it's really important because that way all of our content is up to date with the most scientific evidence.
I love that. And I promise I'll get us back to protein, but this is one of the things that I always say to my peers is we have to be careful about the places we're really dogmatic about things that we truly just don't know enough yet to be so stuck in our ways. We reserve the right to continue to learn. So, okay, we talked about the new guidelines changing really from minimum to prevent disease to more of an optimal range for some of the things that you talked about. And then we're going to dig into those satiety and, muscle maintenance and healthy aging, all of those things. But one of the things I hear often that I want to address is a lot of folks saying, are Americans really falling short? Or is this about protein distribution and protein quality? And so can you just kind of talk, what do they mean when they say that? Talk us through that.
That's the most loaded question, Stacy. Okay, here we go. Let's start it. Okay. So right now, in general, we've seen the data say that consumers are consuming about 1 gram per kilogram. Okay. That's plus or minus depending on age, gender, things like that.
So when
But
they
about
say
one,
they're meeting it per the old 0.8 gram per kilogram.
that's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And until a month ago, it was the 0.8 gram per kilogram. So
That's
I
right.
think it's fair that the old, Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee did say they're over consuming protein because there's nuance there because the science was really saying that we needed the 1.2 to 1.6.
So
So
now per the 1.2 to 1.6, which is the new recommendation, we actually would be falling short.
that's right. I went to a protein meeting last year and I thought this was really interesting. So we've always talked about the RDA, right? What people don't often talk about is the AMDR, the acceptable
Mhm.
macronutrient distribution range. That is 10 to 35%. So if you're trying to go within the AMDR, which is the 10 to 35%, if Americans are consuming 1 gram per kilogram, that means we're about 15% total energy. So we're actually right in the middle of the AMDR. Now, what's really interesting, let's say we were to go on the high level of the AMDR, that means the recommendation would be 2.5 grams per kilogram. So the science and the recommendations have kind of always been in this bigger window, but we have focused so much on the minimum, the 0.8 gram per kilogram, that I think we got distracted for a long time. And now we're finally getting the science up to speed with what the recommendations are.
That's a helpful context. Talk about distribution too, because when we talk distribution, we're really meaning oftentimes what I see is people would skip protein for breakfast. They'd get a little bit of protein for lunch, and then they would get this like massive steak for dinner. And distribution of their protein intake throughout the day wasn't optimal. Can you talk about why that's important?
Yeah, so the science is, I would say, continuously kind of changing on this. But in general, if I were to say there would be a consensus, is about 30 grams of protein per meal. And that's because you need protein at every meal to help with muscle protein synthesis, which is the internal function of what protein does. But you also need protein for things like satiety, right? And so if you're omitting protein, let's say you're having a bowl of cereal or just oatmeal by itself, there's no protein, and then they're starving right
Yeah.
away. And that is biologically, it makes sense because you don't really have satiety with a high carbohydrate food. And so if that's something that you enjoy eating, no problem. You can enjoy those foods, but how do you pair it with the protein? Whether that's adding in peanut butter, throwing on an egg, there's ways that you can get that about 30 grams of protein. Now, do we need 65 grams if we're having a, 12-ounce steak? No, we don't necessarily need that much because that's almost more than our body would be able to process and utilize efficiently. So I wouldn't say that, but if you can hit that 30 grams, and then we can go deep into the protein quality. And I think that's important for some groups, especially when we think about children, infancy, pregnancy, lactation, and aging. Those are like the key populations.
Your high risk populations, really, your
Right.
growth dependent populations.
So that's when protein quality comes into play. Your everyday consumer, I would say protein quality is likely not as important. But if you're working with those more vulnerable growth populations, then yeah, the protein quality is really important.
And we've talked to our listeners about this before. You want to have all of the essential amino acids or building blocks that you need as your body is turning over muscle throughout the day, all day, every day. We talk about this with our athletes. You need to be rebuilding, and you can't rebuild if you don't have all the building blocks. And so healthy individuals like you or I, we're not in one of those high risk populations. We can take amino acids from different parts of our meals throughout the day and build with those. More vulnerable populations, what I hear you saying, and I just want to make sure I'm synthesizing it for our audience, is it can be really hard to do that effectively to maintain muscle mass.
Yeah, I think that was spot on. You explained it a lot better than I did. But I do think that protein quality, it often gets overlooked. Now, if we start to have an increased protein recommendation, and right now consumers are only eating 1 gram of protein, then you may have a bigger need for protein quality to really make sure that people are getting in the window of 1.2 to 1.6 of high quality usable protein. I think that the science is going to continue to evolve to be able to better understand how important quality is. And there's a lot of new techniques coming out on quality. We've talked a lot in the science realm. We have a quality or a bioavailability marker called DIAS. It's a digestibility score. And no surprise, your animal source foods all have a high digestibility score. That means of those 20 amino acids, your body is able to use all those amino acids from the protein. Okay. In the food industry, they actually use PDCAS, which is a different scoring system. It truncates at 1, which DIAS allows for you to go over 100 in terms of the scoring. So animal source foods are typically all at a 1 of the PDCAS. And that will come into play not for the everyday consumer, but if you're getting a plant protein product, let's say in the freezer, they actually need to calculate the protein and overlay the PDCAS to be able to have an accurate label. I think that's really interesting. A lot of people don't know
I think that's important. I want to stick on this for a minute because we'll often say, look at not just, consumers will pick up items from center store and they'll go, oh, it's got 9 grams of protein. But really what that translates to, if I could break that down for those that are listening, is that might not be all of those 9 grams is 100% bioavailable. And so then when you look at the percent daily value, what you'll see is that's lower than you might think it would be for those 9 grams. And that's kind of calculating how much of a complete protein source is it. And that's important to look at because that's the quality of protein that you're getting from that food. You're like, oh, this is great. These waffles have 3 grams of protein, but that might not be what you're looking for.
What I think is really important as consumers are continuously trying to seek out more protein is understanding not all proteins are created equal. And I have a lot of different reasons behind that. It's not only on the protein quality, but also what is that source of protein and what are the other nutrients that you're getting in that source of food that maybe would be different than a different protein food.
Which I want to back us up a little bit because you said something earlier I wanted to touch on. And I think Animal proteins get a bad rap, but one of the things I think that's really interesting about animal proteins that I talk a lot about, I was a CDE for a long time, did diabetes education, is that fat is actually the only nutrient that blunts insulin response in the body. Protein and carbohydrates both drive insulin response. And so one of the things that's unique about, you said, add an egg, add whatever it might be, some dairy, you're getting both a protein source and a fat source simultaneously, which has a very different effect on metabolism and blood glucose and insulin response than if you were just, to your point, eating your oatmeal alone. And so I think the synergistic effect of foods is also something that's truly fascinating when we think about building our plate, that animal proteins contribute more than just protein. They oftentimes are carriers of fats, but also carriers of many other things. So talk to us about what else they provide.
This is one of my favorite things to talk about because oh, let me back up for a second. An IFIC survey, the consumer survey last year came out and said that only 65% of consumers understood that meat was protein. So number one, we need to make sure that we are very clearly communicating to consumers that meat and dairy and eggs are all high quality sources of protein based on these different digestibility scores. But not only are they just protein, you get a whole slew of nutrients, which would be different for each different type of meat or dairy or eggs. But things like calcium that you also get with dairy. You also get iron. You get zinc and selenium for immunity and brain function. You get in pork and eggs, you get choline, right?
I was
And
just about to
vitamin
say,
B.
that's one of my favorite ones. Choline, it's such an undervalued nutrient and so important.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and so that's where when people are looking for more protein in their diet, one of the things that I try and explain is look at what you're getting in addition to the protein. So I'm all for people getting more protein to make sure that they're meeting that window because we want to optimize health, right? And the 1.2 to 1.6 is for optimal health. And so what are those sources? The animal source foods, you're not only getting that high quality protein, which is going to be bioavailable, you're going to be able to use those essential amino acids for building blocks, but you also get a lot of these other nutrients, right? Choline, zinc, iron, selenium, calcium, all your B
Conjugated
vitamins.
linoleic acid in some of your dairy items. Oh my gosh. Well, and I have to say this, I'm going to tell an anecdotal story for our listeners for a minute, but I still remember my first 6 months at HEB. I went with some of our senior leaders to go take a trip to the Dole Nutrition Research Institute in the Carolinas, and fascinating place. I don't know if you've ever been there, but they were researching all of these fascinating micronutrients. Choline was one of them, which was sad to see. They were looking for choline, but only could find it in some animal products. So they stopped research around choline, even though they could see the beneficial impacts it was having to like maternal fetal health. Conjugated linoleic acid was another one that comes to mind because it's only really in dairy products. It is technically a trans fat, but then again, this goes to thinking about trans fats. Are they all created equal? Are all saturated fats created equal? And it does have positive implications to health, but mostly found in dairy. And so I love these stories. I think they're so powerful. And I think back to that of like, well, they stopped researching it because it was in such a small amount of foods. But that's where I think those foods have the most meaningful contribution to the diet because they provide this really unique, distinctive value of nutrition.
Right. Well, and I think that's what the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee and then the subsequent committee, they are showing that. Both of sets of them are saying, look, we understand that you do need animal source foods in terms of contributing some of these key nutrients, which are nutrients of concern, especially for those vulnerable life stages. So I do think that people, they maybe now are catching on that meat and animal source foods are protein, but there's more to that than just protein, right? Even we were talking before, like creatine, which is
Yes.
not, it's talked about in supplemental form, but there's also naturally occurring creatine in things like pork and beef and fish, right? And so how are we explaining that? Which would be if a consumer is going to the grocery store and they're saying, okay, I want 20 grams of protein. They're looking at pancakes and they're looking at your meat products, and they're looking at a cup of yogurt, and they're looking at a can of beans. How are they understanding that each of those foods, and those are more like, I would say, whole sources of foods of
Yes.
protein versus some of your packaged, ultra processed sources of protein, but what other nutrients are coming into play? Because that's what we ultimately want. It's about nutrients. It is protein, but it's all the nutrients that go with protein to help to optimize the metabolism of the protein.
And I think acknowledging too, when many of us dietitians are championing the unique value that animal proteins provide, I think unintentionally what people can hear is that I'm not also championing that plant proteins provide their own substantial, unique benefits to the diet. And I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. I think the power is actually, and I love what you guys do with Pork and Partners, because the reality is these foods were meant to be eaten in like whole food combinations.
Well, and that's how, if you look at traditional recipes, I mean, take out one of your grandma's recipes from back in the day. Everything was animal protein and plants. And I laugh because, in a way, grandma had it right. Because oftentimes, if you look at those meals, they're getting about 20 to 25 grams of protein per serving, which, hello, that's what we see in the science. But then you also have this protein and all the other nutrients in it. And I agree with you, Stacy. When I talk about animal source foods, I have nothing against plant proteins. I actually think they're great ways to not only get some protein, but then you get fiber and a lot of phytonutrients and other nutrients in there, which I think are critical. And that's why we love to talk about pork and plants at the National Pork Board, because people don't eat foods in isolation. So how do you build comfort and confidence that they can eat these foods together, and together those offer optimal nutrients to support health?
Yeah, I love that. And I feel so compelled to share that because I think it's like it has to be one or the other. And the reality is, as a dietitian, we're making half our plate fruits and veggies and all the great things that we're getting all of that great nutrition from. But definitely animal protein is playing its own role in how we put our plates together and for our athletes as well. So I want to talk about protein and satiety. You said that word. And if my business partner, Lindsay, was here, she would nudge me and be like, satiety, what does that mean? Explain that to our listeners. Talk a little bit about that and tell our listeners why protein plays this role in satiety and what it does from an appetite perspective of helping us feel fuller longer.
So I'm not going to get too deep in the sciences, but number one, animal protein and protein in general stimulates GLP-1. So, right, you look at GLP-1 injectables or pills now to help to reduce appetite. Proteins do that naturally. Now, nowhere near to the cadence that an injectable or pharmaceutical will be able to do, but that is part of the mechanism. Is you also have delayed gastric emptying when you have protein, because it helps with the metabolism. And so that is something, like, if you're going to have a meal and you pair a protein with it, it will help slow the digestion, and it'll also help to slow those glucose spikes, especially you're talking about diabetes. If you are going to have your dark chocolate that you want at night, try and pair it with a protein to help to stabilize your blood sugar a little bit more, and you don't just have these massive spikes. So protein comes into play not only metabolically with the hormones, but then it also comes into play with digestion and being able to really make you feel more full. And then when you feel more full, you're eating less food in between meals, right? I remember going back when I first started practicing as a dietitian, it would be like, eat 6 small meals a day, right? Do you remember that? Well, maybe it wasn't that you needed to add more food. Maybe we needed to be more conscious of what food we were adding in between the meals, because we know oftentimes, especially athletes, like, they often are grabbing maybe a bag of chips or maybe a banana or
their
carbohydrate
eating windows
food.
can look really different. Yeah,
Right.
depending on their competitive play during a day or like
Right.
school. Yes.
Well, and they may grab a more high carbohydrate because often those are your ready to eat on the go options. And then, no surprise, they're going to be hungry really soon after. So, how do we educate them? If they want that carb food, no problem. But how do you pair it with a protein to really help them feel more full, to help the muscle protein synthesis, and to make sure that we're feeding them something that offers more nutritional value?
Yeah. And I go back to mechanical digestion. When we go back to biochem 101, protein, it has to actually be broken down by hydrochloric acid in our stomach before it can even move into the small intestines, which is very different than carbohydrates. The moment they hit our tongue, amylase is starting to break down that starch or break down that carbohydrate. So even before it hits our esophagus, our body's working on it, which I want to talk about this for a second. So we have covered this a little bit with our athletes, but talk about the cost to metabolize protein. We often will say that protein is more thermogenically active. So talk about what that means for our listeners.
So it's been estimated that the thermogenic effect of protein is about 20 to 30%, which is significantly higher than both your carbohydrates and your fat sources. And I think that's because our body is innately wanting to digest carbohydrates and use them right away. We actually don't want protein to be digested for energy. And that is on purpose because protein and all amino acids have so many critical roles in the body. Protein does immunity, protein is growth, protein is healing, protein is all your metabolism and hormones, right? You need amino acids for every single function that you have in the body, which is a little bit different than carbohydrate because carbohydrate is going to be that rapid fuel source, or maybe it's glycogen where you have like a stored fuel source for longer running. Protein, we don't want it as energy. And that's also why it takes longer for digestion because we are utilizing these essential amino acids for growth and development. Again, whether that's immunity or muscle. So when people say, well, we don't need that much protein, actually, we do because our body mandatory needs protein. Now, I love the fiber maxing and people saying, oh, fiber is the next protein. I'm like, okay, again, I love plants, nothing against plants. We don't need fiber in our body. Yes, it will help. And we've seen epi data showing that higher fiber intakes correlate with lower metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease. So yes, there's beneficial effects of fiber, but your body doesn't need fiber. Your body
You
needs
need
protein.
protein. Well, and Kevin Hall does a really good job in his most recent book talking about this. And I talk about this a lot with our athletes where I will say, there's a minimum threshold of protein that you need to exist and for your body to function. And what's really interesting, and Dr. Hall says this in his book, is honestly, fats and carbohydrates, your body can interchange between the two of them using them as a fuel source. And so
Yes.
I think that's something we kind of take for granted in Metabolism 101 is that if you are metabolically flexible, as most healthy individuals are, that's where when you run out of those glycogen stores or you don't have carbohydrates coming in, your body switches to fat as the primary fuel source. Maybe not the same mechanisms for someone who maybe isn't as metabolically healthy, which I think we're learning and seeing with GLP-1s and the more we're learning about metabolism. But just to put a bow on this, so protein, it's kind of like giving your body a tree. Well, to use that tree, you have to then chop it down and cut it into blocks. Then you have to shave it into paper, where carbohydrates are like just feeding paper to that fire, and fats may be more like chunks of wood that you're then shaving. And so it costs more calories to utilize protein in the body. And so just thinking about that for our listeners, not just how much protein are you getting, but those thermogenic effects of food.
I have one more thing. One of the things, especially with pork and plants, is 9 in 10 Americans don't consume enough produce, right? Fruits and vegetables. But what do they like? They like protein and they like animal source foods like your meat and your dairy and your eggs. So how can we as dietitians and coaches and health professionals, how do we take what people love and
Yes.
get them to eat more fruits and vegetables? And that's really where pork and plants kind of came alive is we saw it in the research, but then how do we do it in action? So let's say dad's on the grill tonight and he's grilling out ribs. That's great, but how do we add? And I think as dietitians, we have opportunities to stop the stigmatization of food and say, okay, don't eat this because that's why people sometimes felt like we were the food police.
Yeah.
What if we shifted our language and we said, how can we add to this? If you're grilling ribs, how do you add some sweet potato or you can add some broccoli, right? So there's ways that we can add to make the protein be the flavor vehicle to drive people to eat more plants. How do you use that protein to be that flavor vehicle to getting them to eat more fruits and veggies?
I love that so much. I always tell my athletes, we're going to focus on the good to crowd out the bad versus focusing on the bad, which you see a lot of folks doing. And it creates a lot of just disordered beliefs around food and how we think about food when food was really meant to be this great source of fuel. Speaking of that, last night, and like a true dietitian, we put this into practice. We had shrimp pasta, like shrimp Alfredo pasta. But you better believe it had artichokes and olives and sun-dried tomatoes and spinach and green onions. And my kiddos just have come to expect that those vehicles that they love are going to be encapsulated with a whole lot of plants to power that meal. So I love what you're sharing.
Well, and I think it makes nutrition advice practical and people will want to eat it. If you start to go out and say, swap this for this, do you remember those eat this, not that
Not
books?
that,
Like it's
yes.
so many, right? And all you're thinking is, oh my God, I can't eat that. Oh, that's not good for me. Oh, that's not high quality, or that's not meeting X nutrient. If we can get out of that language and start to being like, okay, here's what I want, right? I want to have grilled whatever tonight. I'm thinking grill because I'm in Phoenix. It's already 80 degrees. So I'm already thinking about the grill. But if I want to have grilled chicken, how do I say, okay, let me add to this? And I think it's a great way to show kids balance too and get the kids involved. So even if you have a young athlete from teenagers to, small toddlers, get them involved in helping to pick some of those sides to pair it with that protein to be able to, really make sure that your recommendations and what you're serving aligns with what they're going to eat. And that way you don't have waste too.
Yeah, because the research is one thing, but translating into something that's practical is a whole other. That's why I like to partner with folks like yourself, because you can translate the research and then I help people make it practical for their everyday. So I want to ask you a question on what I think our athletes are most here to hear about, which is protecting muscle mass, muscle function, and recovery and growth when it comes to protein. Talk to us a little bit about protein's role in muscle function and recovery.
So we're really getting new research on this. And especially, I know at the National Pork Board, we had a paper that got published last year from a project we funded looking at a plant-based MRE or, meal recovery versus a pork protein and how that impacted things like inflammation and recovery satisfaction. And no surprise, your animal-based protein is going to have reduced inflammation, higher satisfaction, and help with some of these recovery markers. And that makes sense because, again, your animal source proteins are these bioavailable essential amino acids. So it takes less work to be able to go down and cut the tree and do all the things, right? Because it's ready to go, which is a little bit different than a lot of your plant protein options, which again, I'm all for adding the plant proteins in. But if you're comparing, 20 grams to 20 grams, they're just not equal. And in addition, I think when we think about recovery, not all consumers want high calorie and high volumes of foods in recovery. And that's where I think you have those animal source foods. They're concentrated protein sources. So you need less total volume and you need less amount of food to get the same, if not more protein than if you were
for
to
less
choose
calories, oftentimes.
for less
For
calories
a lot less
than if you were to
calories.
have beans and lentils and plant-based patties, whatever your options are.
We'll
So I
talk
think
about that in
there's
regards to powders really quick, because I see so many of my athletes, unfortunately, like they get done with a workout and instead of eating a meal, which is readily available and sometimes could be cheaper, they're stuffing down a protein powder. Like, give us any research thoughts.
So protein powders are great for people who are on the go. I think it's a good option. Obviously, we always want to direct people to eating whole foods because remember, as we talked about earlier, you get more nutrients than just the protein. So that's would be my direction. So if you have an athlete who's going to those protein shakes afterwards, what if you could start doing small swaps, like start packing snacks, post-workout snacks 2 days a week and see how they feel differently having those, protein powders versus a whole food and see if they notice any differences. I'd say that's like the first step.
Or even, I love dairy. I mean, I love our chocolate Utopia. It's one of my favorites. A perfect 3-to-1 ratio of getting carbohydrates and protein as a great recovery vehicle. And so the robust benefit that you get from those whole foods can be really powerful. Okay, rapid fire to close us out. What's one myth that just drives you crazy about protein?
Well, I think my number one myth is people says we're over consuming protein. I'm like, no, we're not over consuming proteins. The recommendations weren't ideal for optimal intake. So I would say that's my number one thing that drives me crazy. But now we're changing the narrative.
Yeah, I love it. What's one practical strategy that you would give to help listeners increase protein wisely this week?
A practical strategy, I say, one of the things that I do in our household is I pre-prep some protein options. So whether it's, I hard boil some eggs early or I make some sausage patties. So that way when I come back from the gym, because usually I come back from the gym, I shower and I hop into meetings. So I'm coming and I just need something easy. And when I used to go to the cereals and oatmeals, I'm starving right away because I don't have enough protein. So that's my recommendation. Choose 1 or 2 protein options that you like, whether it's a packaged product or a fresh product, and have some ready to go. So after your workout or after you, walk or whatever your exercise is, you'll be able to have that ready to eat.
And so you're aiming for that 20 to 30 grams of protein, which a single boiled egg is only 6 grams. So just really making sure that you're calculating what that looks like. Here's my last. Tell me your favorite go-to protein-filled meal that you love.
I mean, I'm biased because I work for the pork industry. We also live in Arizona. We love having the smoker and we do a lemon pepper smoked pork tenderloin. And then I pair it with a whole bunch of veggies that I either grill or I do a sheet pan veggie. And it is so good. It's simple and I can kind of like let it go while I'm working. So that's my go-to.
I love a good like panko and Parmesan crusted pork tenderloin. So affordable, so easy. I can set it and forget it. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for being on with us today. This was such good information. And I love your wisdom and knowledge to share with our listeners. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on, Stacy.
Stay tuned for more real-world tips and conversations with coaches, athletic directors, current and former collegiate and professional athletes, sports dietitians, sports psychologists, and other performance experts.
If this episode gave you something to chew on, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe. Nutrition is important, but let's be honest, we've all got to eat. So help us feed this podcast so we can keep fueling you.
Don't forget to join the Span Athletics community to get more exclusive content by following us on all of our social media platforms, including TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X at @span_athletics.
Until next time, stay faithful, stay fueled, and remain focused on your goals.